Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for this discussion about the three main tensions that leaders are grappling with right now. Uh, the great thing about this topic is that the tensions are very universal, so I think you're going to find that you can relate to some or maybe all of them, depending on your situation. So I'm going to I'll have our experts introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I want to hear from all of you. My name's Eric Ginsberg. I'm going to be your host from the Center for Creative Leadership today as we dive into this research with ExecOnline. Tell us in the chat where you're tuning in from. And then also, we'd love, as we discuss these tensions, we'd love to hear from you. Which ones are you experiencing? How is this showing up for you and your team at work? And what questions do you have for our panelists? So Sara and Andy are going to answer some questions at the end. If it's super topical, we'll try to squeeze it in the middle. But really, we just want to hear from you about, how this can be most useful for you and your teams. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Sara and Andy. Sara, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. My name is Sara Pixley. I'm head of research at ExecOnline, where I lead the quantitative efforts to track program impact as well as drive the frame-breaking thought leadership and insights, some of which we'll talk through today. A little bit more, my experience started in the world of cognitive science, where I conducted over a decade of learning, memory, and neuroscience research across the entire lifespan, from those young to old. And it's evolved into a research related to HR and leadership development, which I'm really excited and looking forward to discussing today.
Perfect. Thank you and welcome, Sara. Andy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Great. Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Loignon. I'm a senior research scientist here at the Center for Creative Leadership. And I have over 10 years of experience helping organizations use data to address issues related to things like leadership and teams. And much of what I study and I'm interested in is actually reflected in the research and some of the findings we'll be sharing today around the three tensions. So really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to this too. I just want to say for all of you tuning in, Andy and Sara and one of our other colleagues are actually going to dive into this topic in more detail in a longer webinar next week. It's on July 20th. So the link to register for that is in the caption for this video. We encourage all of you to sign up, whether you're watching this live before July 20th or you're watching the recording. It's okay. There will also be a recording of the webinar. So go ahead and sign up, even if you have a scheduling conflict or you're watching this after the fact. All right, let's dive in. So I'm going to start with you, Sara, but as all of you who are tuning in know, leaders are dealing with a lot right now, and the landscape of work looks very different than it did even just a few short years ago, and that's exactly what this research dives into. So I want to hear from all of you who are tuning in. What's been happening in your workplace over the last couple of years? What are your biggest pain points, and how do you relate to these three tensions? All right, Sara, now for you, just to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit more about where this research came from? Like, where did this conversation about leadership tensions start? Big picture, why do this research and why is it important?
Yeah, great. Big picture here. So one of the things that we've been seeing and hearing over the past year and beyond, probably 2 years, is everyone is just facing quite a bit of uncertainty. A lot of it's related to leadership and org changes, but mainly economic volatility. And what's different from 2008, we also have talent pressures due to the effects of COVID and the Great Resignation. So it's a very critical moment right now for leaders to be able to be at their absolute best to address both at the same time. And we know from our data, we'll talk about a lot of it today, it's very difficult for leaders to navigate this. So we set out to ask, what's holding the leaders back? And investigating our data, talking to dozens of L&D professionals, what we kept finding is that there's places where leaders are being pulled in two directions all at once. And what was really fascinating for us is a lot of times organizations don't even know about these tensions. And even if they do, they really don't know how to solve it. So it's a really critical moment in time. We've got to figure out how to alleviate these tensions, these paradoxes, Because quite frankly, Eric, if we don't, the leaders are going to suffer, organizations are going to suffer, and we just won't be able to succeed in this current environment.
That's so well put, Sarah, and thank you for giving us that high level context. I have a feeling that a lot of you in the who are tuning in, and I'm seeing some of this in the chat, but I have a feeling that a lot of you, that even if you knew that this is something that your team was dealing with or that you were dealing with, it's not always clear what to do about it. Exactly to your point, Sarah. So thank you for that framing. And I know I just want to add too that, our team at Center for Creative Leadership is thrilled to have this partnership with you and your team at ExecOnline to really strengthen what we're both able to accomplish and to dig into this a little more and understand the data. So I'm not going to give away what Andy's going to speak to. Just want to say, that this research involved 43,000 survey participants, which is a pretty big number. Honestly, it's a little hard for me to comprehend a number quite that large. But Andy, I want to turn to you to dive in. Out of this research, you all identified the 3 key tensions that leaders are facing. Let's walk through what those tensions are specifically.
Yeah, so one of the first tensions that emerged is we saw several bits of data, several different indicators that leaders, they are feeling socially isolated. They're feeling disconnected from both their colleagues, their team members, and also this kind of challenge of creating connectivity and organizational culture. And they still embrace remote work. They still see value in working virtually and working from home and having a hybrid type of work design. And so that creates kind of a tension and a friction that needs to be addressed. The other tension that emerged in the data is this idea of trying to manage burnout while also pursuing developmental opportunities. We saw leaders saying, hey, I really want to improve. I want to increase my skills. I want to continue to further develop and grow as a leader. And I'm burned out. I mean, across several different indices, upwards of 70% of leaders consistently quarter over quarter saying, I'm just not at my best. I'm not feeling great. And that then raises this issue of, if leadership development is one more thing that comes on top of everything else the leaders are already doing, that's a real tension and a pain point that needs to be addressed. And then lastly, as Sarah was alluding to, some real economic uncertainty, some real economic tensions that these leaders are facing. So having to make hard decisions around headcount, around budget, around real resources, while also ensuring that the people in their teams, their direct reports, their team members, their colleagues, are motivated and engaged to continue to be successful. So when you put these 3 things together, you get a really good understanding of what leaders are facing and the fact that there are these pain points, these tensions, these paradoxes that they have to grapple with right now.
I just want to underline something that you said, Andy, that in some cases, over 70% of leaders reported being burned out. And that's something that we, just as we were talking, that I saw come across the bottom of our screen, somebody saying, before you even spoke to these 3 tensions, they said burnout. So clearly there's a lot here that's resonating with people, and a huge percentage of people probably in your organization, or maybe you're feeling these directly. So for everyone tuning in, we would love to know from you, which one of these 3 tensions are you grappling with the most, and how much does this align to your experience? And if you're not dealing with some of these, we would love to learn from your experience as well. So sort of regardless of where you and your organization are at, please share with us in the comments, so we can have a little bit more context and you can engage with a conversation with everyone else who's joined us today. So Sarah, can you speak a little bit more about the ways in which these tensions show up for leaders? What does this look like? And let us know maybe some examples that you may have come across doing the research of how this manifests for folks.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so there's a lot of tension, as we already discussed, and it really has impacted the broader business. And so first, when you think about the interaction piece, last year in our data, we heard from leaders, 99% of them actually had some form of virtual work, even if it was just a little bit. And they all could see the advantage of that when you can't get into the office. But it's interesting here because, when you think on one hand, a leader will say, oh yeah, I don't have to be commuting. I can wake up a little bit later. You also don't get those regular informal interactions, workplace collisions, if you will, that we know drive innovation. Separate from, you're not getting the face-to-face water cooler or cafeteria run-ins that inspire kind of innovation. So there's certainly conveniences, but then there's things that folks are really craving and missing. And then on the leadership development side, this is something we hear and talk to our clients consistently. Our leaders are begging for more development. Everyone knows they need more development. The organization knows they want to provide it. They give it. And they're so busy. They're struggling to kind of fit it into their schedules at all. And especially if it's scheduled or in person. But even when it's on demand, if you're in back-to-back meetings and exhausted, how can you really take what you're learning and apply it? So it's certainly attention where folks know they need it, but it's hard to really get it and fit it in. And then finally, I saw this coming up in the chat a lot for Maria, for example. Maria, I love your comments in there. These conflicting demands. You've got economic pressures. You got to spend less. On one hand, you've got talent pressures. You have to spend more to keep that talent. I saw that as a big pain point in the chat with retention. How can you do that at the same time? You can't budget your way out of this. And the bigger problem is really what we saw on our data is that actual leaders, when you think about who can balance both strategic prioritization and talent engagement, only 9% of leaders actually have that skill set. So we know it's a really difficult time for many reasons, and these tensions are not just going to go away, and we've got to provide some support in navigating them.
Just like I did with Andy, I want to highlight one of the stats that you said, 9%. That's so low. I'm going to just pretend that I'm one of that magical 9% here. But not really. I mean, these are some pretty startling numbers. On a related note to that, Andy, can you tell us, we're looking at these three tensions. Is there one that was more predominant for folks or organizations? Do you see change over time in how common these issues are, or help us unpack this a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. I think what you see with these tensions is they've been around for quite a period of time. So if you go to that first tension, the idea that leaders enjoy, prefer, see a lot of value in remote or hybrid work, but also feel socially isolated or disconnected, that's a tension that we've known that's existed since the 1990s, maybe even before that, when technology really allowed people to become untethered from the workplace. So as soon as the internet came along and telecommunication allowed us to work remotely, people started doing that, and that tension emerged. But what's interesting now is because of advances in all the software and technology that we're using now, even larger proportions of the workforce are experiencing that tension. So what used to be kind of a small subset of the organization a couple of decades ago is now maybe the majority, if not the entirety of the organization, is experiencing that tension in today's workplace. So what used to be maybe the only one person kind of dialing in and being that sole person on a teleconference call, now it's all of us are working remotely and feeling that tension of, hey, I like the convenience of this, I like the flexibility it provides, and I sure do miss connecting with others in the workplace. And I would say the other tensions too show similar trends. If you look at issues of burnout, I mean, we've got data going back a couple of decades where people have been experiencing this, but now it's growing in its prevalence. And likewise, around this tension of leaders having to make hard choices while continuing to motivate their workforce, CCL has been collecting data for decades on leadership challenges. And that's a constant challenge that kind of comes up in that data as well. But the difference here with some of the data we're seeing through ExecOnline's great efforts is that challenge is starting to kind of permeate throughout the entire leader level, the leader hierarchy.
I love that context, Andy, because I think it could be easy for some folks to look at these and say, yeah, of course, like burnout's not new, it's always existed, or yeah, obviously there's this tension in terms of spending and retention or wanting to give people leadership development, but we've always been busy, sort of what's the big deal, figure it out. And what I took away from what you just said is like the extent to which these have become elevated and more distributed across organizations, that more people in your organization are probably dealing with this than before. Just for me, I think one of the few people that has always been fully remote in my role pre-pandemic. And but definitely see the ways that even in our own organization that applies to more people, or that more people have a hybrid relationship where they do live near the office and come in frequently, but not necessarily every day, or not nearly as much as they used to before. So I can definitely relate to that one in particular. And again, I know we've asked those of you tuning in this already, but would want to hear from you the specifics of how this shows up for you and your team, and also what you're doing to deal with it. Sara, I'm going to turn to you for this next question. But before I do, want to remind everyone tuning in, Sara and Andy are going to be discussing all of this in more detail in a webinar next week. The link is in the caption for this video. We're just going to be able to hit some of the high notes today and help you understand at a fundamental level what the research has found, but really encourage you to sign up for that so you can unpack this in more detail with them and our colleague Paige Graham. Sara, let's talk about the impact of what you found. I'm sure in some ways, like I was saying, that people find this information obvious, that there's burnout and isolation and some other issues that it's not a positive thing for an organization, right? We never want to hear that. But beyond that sort of abstract, this isn't great, like, what does this mean? What are the stakes for organizations with these issues?
Yeah. And the stakes are high. And I hate to just paint a negative picture, which is why I'm excited to be going through the webinar and the solutions. But let's talk about the impact. And the impact is big. And it's, I'd say over the past 2 years, we're seeing kind of more pain around this, as Andy and you both alluded to. For the interaction piece, if you can't build relationships, they're just harder to manage. That means lower productivity and performance across teams. It hurts the organization's bottom line, but really the morale and engagement at the entire organization. And so we're really beginning to understand those core folks, managers, those kind of, not at the very top, although at the very top, they're feeling those tensions as well. One disengaged leader can have an impact on a really large number of people. So we're seeing that grow. When you think about leadership development, this is the really hard one to resolve. If leaders can't, this is a critical time for leaders. We know that. And if they can't get the learning that they need, they just won't be effective. It's really demoralizing in a sense too. And so if they aren't hitting their goals, there's certainly impact on the organization, but impact on that individual on just not being able to get the development they need. And, one of the things that finally, when we think about the capability, being able to kind of manage both of these tensions at the same time, strategic prioritization and talent engagement, we have got to be able to do both. Again, we've got broader implications on the entire business, right? When you can't actually balance these two tensions. So lots of negative implications throughout, oftentimes on the leader themselves, but also the broader teams. And then as a result, the broader organization.
Yeah, Sara, you just spoke to this, and I don't know if the research covered this, but it brings up a follow-up question for me. To what extent are we seeing this happen at a team level and ripple out to the larger organization? Or are we talking about org-wide, or, if this exists in a pocket of a company or organization, does that typically spill over? Do you have a sense of essentially what I'm saying is, do you have a sense of whether this could be an acute problem within an organization, or whether these typically span an entire organization? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, we certainly sense that it spans the entire organization. Both when you look at the leaders, you look at the pain, you look how it's growing. When you think about the impact it has on higher leaders, lower level leaders, when you think about the impact it has on L&D professionals, right? They're also having to help leaders balance this really difficult time as well. So we're seeing broad impact of these tensions. And, some, for example, have been back to work this full time. So that the hybrid, that's not as much of an issue, but certainly understanding and feeling the tensions as it relates to just organizational changes, leadership changes, pretty much all across industries. We're seeing that materialize. And so the question for everyone is how do you balance engagement? I saw that in the chat a lot. Burnout leads to social loafing. I'm seeing comments. And when you have disengaged leaders, it really has a ripple effect. We're certainly seeing it. And we're seeing a moment in time where organizations themselves are not in consensus on what you should do to solve it. And so I think that's another tension that we're seeing, that is really just between the L&D professionals trying to sort this out, knowing we can't just go back to how we used to operate, but what's the answer? And nobody, that's the age-old question. What's the answer? And I think Andy has some great solutions to that. And we'll talk about that in the webinar. But there are answers out there, and there are ways to navigate this. That everyone is seeking them, whether you're a leader, whether you're an organization.
Yeah, just to underscore what Sarah's saying, we're not going to dive into all of those solutions now, just for the sake of time. But you can sign up for the webinar and get more of those takeaways. We want to move to some audience questions. So if you haven't asked your question yet, please go ahead and put that in the comments. We will do our best to answer it as we have time. Question that's come in the chat that I want to pose to you, Andy. Someone's asked, does being an inclusive leader add to these tensions? And is that something that your research covered?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that there wasn't necessarily direct survey items talking about being an inclusive leader or pursuing inclusivity as a leader, but I would imagine that the challenge of becoming an inclusive leader or being an inclusive leader is reflected in these tensions. So for example, to the extent that, generating inclusivity and inclusion inside of your team, your department, is facilitated by these face-to-face interpersonal connections that we've been talking about, well, it might mean that becomes a little bit more challenging in a virtual environment. It may be something that's more intentional that you have to pursue. Likewise, with this idea of leadership development, but also feeling burned out, if you're not feeling like you have the full skill set, all the knowledge on how to be an inclusive leader, getting to that stage, kind of moving forward in your development to become that inclusive leader, it might feel that much more challenging if you're already feeling stressed, disengaged, burned out in your job. And so I would say that we didn't necessarily directly assess this notion of inclusive leadership. I think it's a very relevant topic. And my guess would be that becoming an inclusive leader or being an inclusive leader is just a little bit more challenging in the current environment, given the other signals and findings that we're seeing come through in the data.
Yeah, and
anything you'd add?
Yeah, I can add there. I think absolutely underscore everything Andy just said, which is there's no doubt in a kind of hybrid world, it's harder to be inclusive. And we certainly have evidence of that and seeing those challenges kind of popping up more. The good thing is, though, if you can do it right, and even though it's harder, if you can do it, we do show that when folks are remote or hybrid, when they can actually embody what it means to be an inclusive leader, that has great impact on leadership engagement, more likely to retain your teams. And so if you can do it, it certainly has the impact that you'd want. It just certainly is more difficult in this environment.
I think that's a great point, Sarah. I mean, something that we talk about at Center for Creative Leadership is the importance of creating belonging and how that can happen in a virtual environment as well. And so it makes sense that, if you think about people feeling socially isolated, if you and your organization can create more belonging and inclusion, that can help ease these tensions too. So there can be a positive cascade of impact there, it sounds like. Andy, did you want to add something?
Well, I would just say, I think Sarah alluded to this earlier, that there's a way in which when you start talking about these tensions in the data, it can feel really doom and gloom and kind of glass half empty and really a negative connotation. But I think what you just touched upon, Eric, and what Sarah was mentioning is that tensions also reflect an opportunity, right? So if there's a way in which if you as a leader or you as a member of your organization can start working through these tensions, you're probably going to find yourself in a better place than you would be just to simply ignore them. So there's a way in which these tensions aren't great, not fantastic to kind of see some of the signals in the data that we're seeing. And if you and your team can address them and others in your organization can address them, you'll probably find yourself in a better positioning, both as an individual leader and as a broader organization and as a collective.
I love that. That makes perfect sense. I realized that I didn't ask either of you to go into more detail about who exactly the survey covers. So I want to just take a second for either of you to say, this 43,000 people that we're pulling from, as well as the other, research that was folded in to inform these findings. Who are we talking about here? Are we talking about a specific region, industry, leader level type of role, or who does this speak to?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So yeah, 40, big number, 40,000 leaders across the globe. So it's certainly widespread geographically across industry as well, and across level. So we've got middle managers all the way up to VPs and C-suite. And again, that's the fantastic thing I think that allowed us to delve into these tensions is that it was really across the board. It wasn't just one segment of the population. It wasn't one industry. It wasn't one region, and it wasn't one level. It was pretty global across all. It's a big span, folks.
Yeah, I'd be curious for everyone tuning in, how do you feel like maybe these tensions show up differently depending on what level you're at in the organization? If you're a senior leader, does this look different than if you're a frontline leader? I would be curious to hear some of that from those of you who are tuning in, and what your experiences are right now. Sara or Andy, another question that's come in the chat. Someone wants to know, and you've spoken to this a little bit, but if you could elaborate, does loneliness lead to burnout? These first tension and the second tension tied in that way?
I can take a first stab at this. I would say that the research is pretty consistent in the sense that a lot of these well-being measures, whether it's kind of your loneliness or social connection versus burnout versus engagement, all of those things, they tend to hang together. And so, the extent to which you're feeling stressed and you're feeling burned out, that might then also be associated with feeling lonely. And so there's a way in which it's a kind of a constellation of all these different well-being metrics more broadly. And so, yeah, I would definitely say that to the extent that you find yourself working from home and you're really enjoying that flexibility and you're feeling lonely, and perhaps maybe for you as an individual or somebody as an individual, that social connection matters a ton or is really important to you, that could start to kind of spill over into burnout. And I would say, there's that these tensions, we have to kind of present them in a way that they're kind of distinct and separate, but the spirit of the question is very well taken, that, there's a lot of kind of broad macro changes that are shifting right now that are all kind of contributing to these tensions becoming more prevalent, and they likely relate to each other.
Yeah. I can add there too. You spoke a little bit about this or hinted at the different segments. And when you look at the tensions across segments, they materialize a little bit differently as well. And so what's interesting is when you look at those senior leaders at the very top, you hear a lot about, maintaining culture is difficult and well-being. But when you move your way down to folks who are managing large teams and more junior leaders, one of the things that they're really struggling with is just prioritization, doing more with less. And so real practical leadership development skills that will just help them manage the day-to-day, because there's a lot of pressures and burdens. So, again, these tensions manifest all across the workforce, just in slightly different ways, depending on where you are and who you're managing.
That's really helpful context. Speaking of the ways this data might look different depending on where you are, we have a question in the comments. Someone wants to know, were leaders from one country more tense than others? And I would just, myself, I'm going to add to that, are there other variations that you saw globally in terms of, where these tensions are more prevalent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things I will say, just across the board, having more challenges, it's something what we see, it doesn't matter where you are globally. They may manifest themselves slightly different depending on the geographic location. So I couldn't speak to that right off the bat, but what I can say is having to do more with less is extremely consistent across region. So that is the thing, that it really doesn't matter where you are. Leaders are feeling the pressure and the real difficulty in prioritization right now.
That doesn't surprise me, to be honest, unfortunately. Great. Well, that's all that we have time for today. I just really want to thank Sara and Andy, both of you, for being here. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Again, if you want to hear more about the solutions and also more details about these three tensions that leaders like you are facing, really encourage you to register for our upcoming webinar. It's next week on July 20th, and it's free. And so Sara and Andy and our colleague Paige Graham are going to dive a little deeper into the topic than July 20th. So Sara and Andy, thank you so much for being here today. I learned a lot, and I've read the research, so there's so much richness here for people to dive into. So yeah, just gratitude to both of you and to your broader teams that brought this research forward. For everyone tuning in, again, sign up for the webinar, but also please share this conversation with your networks, both your social networks wherever you're tuning in, but maybe also your colleagues directly. It's a great way to start the conversation on any of these topics or all of them and how they're intertwined. So again, thank you all for tuning in. And Sarah and Andy, thank you to you in particular for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric.
All right. Bye, everybody.